Wait a minute. I thought I finished. Not to dwell on them. Yes. Imprudence. Yes. Okay. Oof. I'm sweating? Because I took a shower. I'm gonna turn on air conditioning and then it's time to devote ourselves to George. Whew. Welcome to the Henry George Daily Devotional 45. I am tired because I biked 30 miles. That's not relevant to George, so let's get to it. Chapter 5, The Law of Interest. This is in Book 3, The Laws of Distribution. Let us turn now to the law of interest. That's funny because it is also the law of interest. Keeping in mind two things to which attention has heretofore been called, viz. First, that it is not capital which employs labor, but labor which employs capital. Second, that capital is not a fixed quantity, but can always be increased or decreased, one, by the greater or less application of labor to the production of capital, and two, by the conversion of wealth into capital, or capital into wealth. For capital being but wealth applied in a certain way, wealth is the larger and inclusive term. Okay, that's what we already established. If you don't buy those, I guess you need to watch or listen to some of the earlier Henry George Daily Devotionals, or just quit watching, or watch and disagree. George continues, it is manifest that under conditions of freedom, the maximum that can be given for the use of capital will be the increase it will bring, and the minimum, or zero, will be the replacement of capital. For above the one point, the borrowing of capital would involve a loss, and below the other, capital could not be maintained. Observe again, it is not, as is carelessly stated by some writers, the increased efficiency given to labor by the adaptation of capital to any special form or use which fixes this maximum, but the average power of increase which belongs to capital generally. Yes. It's not any special form of efficiency. It is the average power of increase. The power of applying itself is in advantageous forms is a power of labor, which capital as capital cannot claim nor share. A bow and arrows will enable an Indian to kill, let us say, a buffalo every day, while with sticks and stones he could hardly kill one in a week. But the weapon maker of the tribe could not claim from the hunter 6 out of every 7 buffaloes killed as a return for the use of a bow and arrows. Nor will capital invested in a woolen factory yield to the capitalist the difference between the produce of the factory and what the same amount of labor could have obtained with the spinning wheel and hand loom. William, when he borrows a plane from James, does not in that obtain the advantage of the increased efficiency of labor when using a plane for the smoothing of boards over what it was when smoothing them with a shell or flint? Aha, that's now we know what a plane is used for in carpentry. Who knew? Planes, they're flat. Maybe not in curved space. I don't know. The progress of knowledge has made the advantage involved in the use of planes a common property and a power of labor. What he gets from James is merely such advantage as the element of a year's time will give to the possession of so much capital as is represented by the plane. Now, if the vital forces of nature which give an advantage to the element of time be the cause of interest, it would seem to follow that this maximum rate of interest would be determined by the strength of these forces and the extent to which they are engaged in production. But while the reproductive force of nature seems to vary enormously, as for instance between the salmon, which spawns thousands of eggs, and the whale, which brings forth a single calf at intervals of years, between the rabbit and the elephant, the thistle and the gigantic redwood, it appears from the way the natural balance is maintained that there is an equation between the reproductive and destructive forces of nature which, in effect, brings the principle of increase to a uniform point. This natural balance man has within narrow limits the power to disturb, and by the modification of natural conditions may avail himself at will of the varying strength of the reproductive force in nature. But when he does so, there arises from the wide scope of his desires another principle which brings about in the increase of wealth a similar equation and balance to that which is affected in nature between the different forms of life. It'd be pretty funny if a whale could give birth to thousands of baby whales every year. Pretty funny. Not relevant exactly. This equation exhibits itself through values. If in a country adapted to both, I go to raising rabbits and you to raising horses, my rabbits may, until the natural limit is reached, increase faster than your horses. But my capital will not increase faster, for the effect of the varying rates of interest will be to lower the value of rabbits as compared with horses, and to increase the value of horses as compared with rabbits. Though the varying strength of the vital forces of nature is thus brought to uniformity, there may be a difference in the different stages of social development as to the proportional extent to which, in the aggregate production of wealth, these vital forces are enlisted. I realize these sentences are long and windy, but they don't seem that important to really dig into. But as to this, there are two remarks to be made. Okay. In the first place, although in such a country as England, the part taken by manufactures in the aggregate wealth production has very much increased, as compared with the part taken by agriculture, yet it is to be noticed that to a very great extent that this is true only of the political or geographical division and not of the industrial community. Okay. For industrial communities are not limited by political divisions or bounded by seas or mountains. They are limited only by the scope of their exchanges, and the proportion which in the industrial economy of England agriculture and stock raising bear to manufactures is averaged with Iowa and Illinois, with Texas and California, with Canada and India, with Queensland and the Baltic. In short, with every country to which the world-wide exchanges of England extend. In the next place, it is to be remarked that although in the progress of civilization the tendency is to the relative increase of manufactures as compared with agriculture, and consequently to a proportionately less reliance upon the reproductive forces of nature, yet this is accompanied by a corresponding extension of exchanges, and hence a greater calling in of the power of increase which thus arises. So these tendencies, to a great extent, and probably as far as we have yet gone, completely balance each other and preserve the equilibrium which fixes the average increase of capital and or the normal rate of interest. All right. Clearly, this bit isn't as exciting to me as the other parts of the book. Now, this normal point of interest, which lies between the necessary maximum and the necessary minimum of the return to capital, must, wherever it rests, be such that all things, such as the feeling of security, desire for accumulation, etc., considered, the reward of capital and the reward of labor will be equal, that is to say, will give an equally attractive result for the exertion or sacrifice involved. It is impossible, perhaps, to formulate this point, as wages are habitually estimated in quantity and interest in a ratio, but if we suppose a given quantity of wealth to be the produce of a given amount of labor, co-operating for a stated time with a certain amount of capital, the proportion in which the produce would be divided between the labor and the capital would afford a comparison. There must be such a point at, or rather about, which the rate of interest must tend to settle, since unless such an equilibrium were effected, labor would not accept the use of capital, or capital would not be placed at the disposal of labor. For labor and capital are but different forms of the same thing, human exertion. All right, that's a key sentence. Labor and capital are different forms of the same thing, human exertion. This is sort of what links them. We make capital by laboring, and we wouldn't make more capital if the interest for lending of capital weren't enough to get us to not just do the normal labor, right? Capital is produced by labor. It is, in fact, but labor impressed upon matter, labor stored up in matter, like potential energy. It is to be released again as needed, as the beat of the sun stored up in coal. Potential energy is released in the furnace. The use of capital in production is, therefore, but a mode of labor. As capital can be used only by being consumed, its use is the expenditure of labor, and for the maintenance of capital. Its production by labor must be commensurate with its consumption in aid of labor. Hence, the principle that, under circumstances which permit free competition, operates to bring wages to a common standard and profits to a substantial equality. The principle that men will seek to gratify their desires with the least exertion operates to establish and maintain this equilibrium between wages and interest. Hooray. This natural relation between interest and wages, this equilibrium at which both will represent equal returns to equal exertions, may be stated in a form which suggests a relation of opposition. Whoa. But this opposition is only apparent. In a partnership between Dick and Harry, the statement that Dick receives a certain proportion of the profits, here we go using the word profits, implies that the portion of Harry is less or greater as Dick's is greater or less. But where, as in this case, each gets only what he adds to the common fund, the increase of the portion of the one does not decrease what the other receives. Ah, yes. If I work extra hard, that doesn't mean that your capital suddenly works less hard. Anyway. And this relation is fixed. And this relation fixed, it is evident that interest and wages must rise and fall together, and that interest cannot be increased without increasing wages, nor wages lowered without depressing interest. Yes. If my labor is worth a lot, then to get me to store my labor up in creation of capital, we'll say not my labor, but if anyone around hiring a day laborer is very expensive, then if we want to store up labor by having labor spend a bunch of time making capital, that capital is going to be costly because the labor is costly, and so then borrowing that capital from somebody else is going to be costly, is going to be at a higher interest because it is stored up labor. And labor, in this scenario we stipulated, was high value. You've persuaded me again, Georgie boy. 4. If, we got both capitalized, wages fall, interest must also fall in proportion. In our weird world, our interest is linked to just this arbitrary control the Fed has over the money supply. So that's slightly a different concept of interest, I would guess. I don't, the Fed wasn't around in George's time. Whoa, Jotson in the chat says, have you played the new Hot City game Manor Lords? Everyone seems to be playing it. I knew people were playing Manor Lords, and it has something called land tax, I hear. Wow, they should submit to the George Jam, which I need to host annually soon. We'll have to look into that one. I mean, yeah, there are historical precedents for land taxes, and the landed class trying to get rid of them and instead have income tax and tariffs. But that is interesting. Maybe the revolution is about to begin. Everyone go play Manor Lords after you play Flock of Dogs and Tankard. I still haven't looked up. I was thinking about, well, not relevant to devotional. I have to stay focused. I have to stay devoted to the devotional. If wages fall, else it becomes more profitable to turn labor into capital than to apply it directly. While this has a lot of this bears relation to like automation and stuff. Assuming that like the AI, if it's like if it's non-proprietary technology and anyone can just construct, an automaton, and it's not somebody with monopoly power over some technology, then we're only going to create enough automatons to the point where, you know, it makes sense given how expensive it is to pay someone to do it manually. Anyway, while if interest falls, wages must likewise proportionately fall, or else the increment of capital would be checked. We are, of course, not speaking of particular wages and particular interest, but of the general rate of wages and the general rate of interest, meaning always by interest the return which capital can secure, less insurance and wages of superintendents. Again, right, we have to always remember we're not talking about, uh, you know, taking on risk, because if you're willing to take on a lot of risk, the return could be a lot higher, because in the aggregate, some people will lose out and some people will win out in those ventures. And on the average, your return to capital will be about the same. Supposedly, empirically, this has been shown a number of times, but I don't know. In a particular case or a particular employment, the tendency of wages and interest to an equilibrium may be impeded, but between the general rate of wages and the general rate of interest, this tendency must be prompt to act. For though in a particular branch of production the line may be clearly drawn between those who furnish labor and those who furnish capital, yet even in communities where there is the sharpest distinction between the general class of laborers and the general class of capitalists, these two classes shade off into each other by imperceptible gradations, and on the extremes where the two classes meet in the same persons, the interaction which restores equilibrium, or rather prevents its disturbance, can go on without obstruction. Whatever obstacles may exist where the separation is complete. Whatever obstacles may exist where the separation is complete. And furthermore, it must be remembered, as has before been stated, that capital is but a portion of wealth, distinguished from wealth, generally, only by the purpose to which it is applied, and hence the whole body of wealth has upon the relations of capital and labor the same equalizing effect that a flywheel has upon the motion of machinery, taking up capital when it is in excess and giving it out again when there is a deficiency, just as a jeweler may give his wife diamonds to wear when he has a superabundant stock, and put them in his showcase again when his stock becomes reduced. Listen, honey, I need your earrings, babe. I know. Yeah. Um, Henry George wrote a very sweet letter to his wife on their 23rd anniversary when he didn't have any money to give her anything. Or maybe he did. Maybe he had those earrings, but he's had to sell them or had to put them on display in the shop. Had to take them back. Let's continue. Thus, any tendency on the part of interest to rise above the equilibrium with wages must immediately beget not only a tendency to direct labor to the production of capital, but also the application of wealth to the uses of capital. While any tendency of wages to rise above the equilibrium with interest must, in like manner, beget not only a tendency to turn labor from the production of capital, but also to lessen the proportion of capital by diverting from a productive to a non-productive use some of the articles of wealth of which capital is composed. To recapitulate, there is a certain relation or ratio between wages and interest, fixed by causes which, if not absolutely permanent, slowly change, at which enough labor will be turned into capital to supply the capital which, in the degree of knowledge, state of the arts, density of population, character of occupations, variety, extent, and rapidity of exchanges, will be demanded for production, and this relation or ratio of the interaction of labor and capital constantly maintains. Hence, interest must rise and fall with the rise and fall of wages. To illustrate, okay, the price of flour is determined by the price of wheat and the cost of milling. The cost of milling varies slowly and but little, the difference being, even at long intervals, hardly perceptible, while the price of wheat varies frequently and largely. Hence we correctly say that the price of flour is governed by the price of wheat. Or, to put the proposition in the same form as the preceding, there is a certain relation or ratio between the value of wheat and the value of flour, fixed by the cost of milling, which relation or ratio the interaction between the demand for flour and the supply of wheat constantly maintains. Hence the price of flour must rise and fall with the rise and fall of the price of wheat. The price of flour is determined by the price of wheat and the cost of milling. Yes, because you have to mill the wheat to get the flour. And when wheat goes up, flour goes up because milling kind of stays constant. Gotcha. Or, as the leaving the connecting link, the price of wheat, to inference, we say that the price of flour depends upon the character of the seasons, wars, etc. So may we put the law of interest in a form which directly connects it with the law of rent, by saying that the general rate of interest will be determined by the return to capital upon the poorest land to which capital is freely applied, that is to say, upon the best land open to it without the payment of rent. Thus we bring the law of interest into a form which shows that it to be a corollary of the law of rent. Nice. That was a great move, George. We went for 15 minutes without talking about land, and then at the end he's like, oh shit, all this actually comes back to the land. Let's reread that bit again. The general rate of interest will be determined by the return to capital upon the poorest land to which capital is freely applied. That's right, because this would be where you could use that capital without having to pay anybody else to use it. That is to say, Jotson in the chat says, wow. Jotson, of course, being the friend John that this is all meant to persuade to be. All these devotionals are all for his sake. This is all for him. Okay, let's start this sentence over because this is the big kahuna. The general rate of interest will be determined by the return to capital upon the poorest land to which capital is freely applied. That is to say, upon the best land open to it without the payment of rent. Rent being how much you have to pay to use land. Thus, we bring the law of interest into a form which shows it to be a corollary of the law of rent. Remember the law of rent as being officially... are we going to be able to get back to where I was? I don't know. The rent of land is determined by the excess of its produce over that which the same application can secure from the least productive land in use. So that least productive land in use is, again, running us up against, well, yeah, this is what's determining the land that can be used freely because it will have zero rent. Because there's no excess over its the least productive land in use is the free land. back. We may prove this conclusion in another way. So another comment though, we might think of interest as this very sort of intangible thing when we think of just, in our modern perspective of the money supply and the Fed and whether they print money or not print money. Again, we're sort of operating under an assumption of like a fixed money supply that's not being messed with. And so you have to like forget your 21st or even your 20th century mindset about the Fed setting an interest rate and printing a ton of money and messing with the economy in that way. You just need to think much more about capital as bits of wealth that can be converted into producing more wealth, and how much you need to pay to borrow that capital from somebody to use it. And that is what we're talking about for interest. It is the return to capital. We may prove this conclusion in another way, for that interest must decrease as rent increases, we can plainly see if we eliminate wages. To do this, we must, to be sure, imagine a universe organized on totally different principles. Nevertheless, we may imagine what Carlyle would call a fool's paradise, where the production of wealth went on without the aid of labor and solely by the reproductive forces of capital, where sheep bore ready-made clothing on their backs, cows presented butter and cheese, and oxen, when they got to the proper point of fatness, carved themselves into beefsteaks and roasting ribs, where houses grew from the seed, and a jackknife thrown upon the ground would take root and in due time bear a crop of assorted cutlery. Sounds like a good sci-fi fantasy world premise. Imagine certain capitalists transport. It sounds very Adventure Timey. Imagine certain capitalists transported with their capital in appropriate forms to such a place. Manifestly, they would get, as the return for their capital, the whole amount of wealth it produced, only so long as none of its produce was demanded as rent. When rent arose, it would come out of the produce of capital, and as it increased, the return to the owners of capital must necessarily diminish. This sounds like a good setup for a little Weird George's dystopian novel or video game. If we imagine the place where capital possessed this power of producing wealth without the aid of labor to be of limited extent, say an island, we shall see that as soon as capital had increased to the limit of the island to support it, the return to capital must fall to a trifle above its minimum of mere replacement, and the land owners would receive nearly the whole produce as rent. For the only alternative capitalists would have would be to throw their capital into the sea. Or, if we imagine such an island to be in communication with the rest of the world, the return to capital would settle at the rate of return in other places. Interest there would be neither higher nor lower than anywhere else. Rent would obtain the whole of the superior advantage, and the land of such an island would have a great value. Yeah, so if this magic island actually existed in our world, the owners of that land would have great value, and everyone who worked the land, of course you don't even work the land, you just plant your capital and it grows. You wouldn't get much for your capital though. To sum up, the law of interest is this. The relation between wages and interest is determined by the average power of increase which attaches to capital from its use in reproductive modes. That's right. The reproductive modes determines the relation between wages and interest. Yes. As rent arises, interest will fall as wages fall, or will be determined by the margin of cultivation. Margin of cultivation is referring again to marginal land, which is the land that can be used without having to pay any rent. And again, this is average power of increase attached to capital from the reproductive forces of nature. There are particular wages and particular bits of interest that might shoot up or fall down. I don't know. George says, I have endeavored at this length to trace out and illustrate the law of interest more in deference to the existing terminology and modes of thought than from the real necessities of our inquiry, were it unembarrassed by befogging discussions. In truth, the primary division of wealth in distribution is dual, not tripartite. Capital is but a form of labor, and its distinction from labor is in reality but a subdivision, just as the division of labor into skilled and unskilled would be. In our examination we have reached the same points as would have been attained had we simply treated capital as a form of labor, and sought the law which divides the produce between rent and wages. That is to say, between the possessors of the two factors, natural substances and powers, and human exertion, which two factors by their union produce all wealth. Yes. When we talk about the factors of production, everyone says labor, capital, and land. But when we realize that capital is but stored up labor, one could simply discuss it as labor and land. But because of all of the befogging that's happened, George wants to deal with it separately and dig deep. All right, that was a long one. It's a little boring for a bit, but then George came through at the end. See you next time. See you Monday. Hasta lasagna. Don't get any on ya. All right, recording done. Manor Lord's land tax. We'd recommend increasing your land tax as high as you can go without tipping your approval rating down below 50%, at which point your problem will no longer increase. Oh, they're saying your approval rating would shoot through the roof as you taxed land, and all the landlords was there are 7 different tax options, but all current are disabled for the only 2 are now there's only 2 types: land tax and tithe. Tithe increases your influence, but land tax is what you need if you want to increase your treasury stockpile. We'd recommend increasing your land tax as high as it can go without tipping your approval rating below 50%. Interesting. Very interesting. Sounds like they don't have it quite right, in my opinion. There's a concept of regional wealth. Like how are your people, are you playing it? It's like, are citizens, you're a feudal lord, you're a lord, and who owns the land, who's paying the land tax? Because under like a feudal system, and you're the feudal lord, you just own all the land. So the land tax would be a tax on you, which, I don't know. But are you the king and you have a whole bunch of feudal lords under you or something? haven't played it, but I think regional wealth goes to the people, and the land tax takes some of the regional wealth and gives it to you. Oh, well. Well, who owns the land? The law of interest. Honestly, I should probably play it, write an article about it through Georgism, and then try to get Polygon, Kotaku, The Verge, what's that other? VentureBeat, whoever, to publish my article. Or Lars Doucet should do it, but he doesn't really do much anymore. George reminds us of where we've been. That's not important. Since capital is but labor stored up, the return to capital interest is linked to the return to labor wages. They rise and fall together. Consider wheat. Consider milling wheat for flour when yeah. George imagines a world with no labor, and then the landlords would where knives grow on trees, and the landlords would get pretty much everything. George tells us the law of interest because interest because interest is the return to capital, which is but stored up labor. Its rate connected to the average reproductive forces of nature. Then, like labor will be determined by the margin by what you could get from working the free. The worst land, aka the free land. Oops, not this. Hey, Justin. Alright. We have to update our précis. Chapter 5. The law of interest. George reminds us of, he called it, we can leave that bit out. Capital is but labor stored up. We could just think of this whole thing as labor. We could just think of the production, of the factors of production as labor and land, but we have to deal with there's been a lot of befogging. So wages return to labor and interest return to capital rise and fall together. This is on average as one changes in value. Suppose wages went up, then interest would need to go up to persuade labor to store up to build up capital. Capital can be converted to wealth as needed as well. All this for equilibrium. George gives some examples. Wheat fluctuates in price. Milling constant. Therefore, flour fluctuates in price. Imagine fool's paradise with capital growing on trees. The landlords still win. Oh yeah, first he also talks about consider how industrial sector is linked internationally, and so average interest is affected. I don't know. Return. The law of rent. No, not law of rent. Law of interest. Wait. I am getting lost. The law of interest. Oh, we are gonna go back to wages and the law of. I guess okay. We didn't do the law of wages. Didn't we do the law of wages? We did the law of rent. I guess not, but basically. Fool's paradise. Oh wait, when did he first bring in land? Where did he first talk about land? I guess. Only 1,300 references to land. Yeah. The general rate of interest will be determined by the return of capital upon the poorest land to which capital is freely applied. Okay. Return to capital determined by the Uh, return of applying it to the marginal land. I get confused about marginal land. Is it the land that is in use by somebody, or is it and it's the absolute cheapest that is currently being used, so the worst quality land that's being used, or is it the land that is the best of the land that no one is using? It all comes back to land. The law of interest. Whoa. All right. We precede the chapter. Switch account. HGDD. Why do Asians look so much younger than other ethnicities? This is 45, Book 3, Chapter 5. In totality. We are not updating because we have tried to update like 4 times and it doesn't work. Ding. Not made for kids. Esperanto. Not entertainment. 70 minutes left. Audience size is 5. I think that's a record high. Oh baby, the revolution, the George made revolution. Wave. That is the right file. Henry George. You know, for a while I would occasionally call Henry George George Henry. now. No, no. Season 1, episode 45. Alright, now do Who Wants to Watch an hour and a half lecture on the money supply and see if this is if this is as big a deal as the land monopoly. I don't think so. My intuition is, you know, these crazy booms and busts around the turn of the 20th century, these huge depressions and then huge booms, they were happening all the time, or well, they were happening in succession, and they were horrible. And so, through trial and error, the government, the U.S. government wasn't like so horribly corrupt, and then they established the Fed, and through trial and error, they have found that they can sort of blunt how bad recessions are, and also blunt how good the good times are through meddling with the money supply. Because you get these waves of land speculation underpinning the whole economy, and then eventually, if everyone is just speculating, no one's producing, then it all crumbles, and that's when you have your big recessions. And so, by having the Fed basically manipulate the money supply by printing more and less money, which is like a weird kind of tax, they're able to disincentivize speculation before it gets too horrible, I suppose, at the cost of everybody a little bit and production. I don't know. And honestly, that bit of smoothing has probably just enabled us to think that we sort of figured out what happens with recessions, and that we can fix recessions just by just having exactly the right policies from the Fed, and we just haven't figured it out yet. It's only been 100 years, and it's all downstream of the land problem, and that the fact that you can just print money is just this fake tax, hidden tax of everyone who has money, as in the form of currency. But then, of course, because they're loaning it out to all of these banks, the bank owes $100,000, then the government goes and prints $1 million billion. Well, then that 100,000 doesn't represent nearly as much wealth anymore. So it's all just a big bailout and bonus to the banking sector, who is mostly skimming off the top of the land. Most of what banks invest in is land. I mean, a lot of it is directly land through like residential, and a lot of it is just mixed in with commercial via commercial property. So it's like partially business, but mostly land. That's what I think. And if you just deal with the land issue, and then you either don't print money, so you do have, I don't know, or you print money at some known regular rate that everyone knows about. It seems the fairest way. I don't know. George writes more. He has another book about social progress or something I haven't read yet. And I am interested in watching this. I guess, do I want to watch it now or work on my video game? Um, how fast does an eye blink? The averaging lasts only a tenth of a second, 100 milliseconds. How fast does a pigeon flap? 5.5 beats per second. One. Ooh, it's close. Meanwhile, an eye can blink in um, zero point 0.1 seconds, aka 100 milliseconds. A pigeon can flap its wing in 0.18 and 0.182 seconds, aka 182 milliseconds. Google does say that some eye blinks can be a lot slower. So, Anna has partial credit.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Henry George School for our 5-session course on Silvio Gesell. The correct title is Silvio Gesell, Beyond Capitalism versus Socialism, question mark. Our instructor throughout this journey is George Sidman, an economics and Japanese language graduate and former Wall Street financial analyst with Goldman Sachs. After Goldman, Josh worked as a Japanese equity derivative trader at Morgan Stanley in London and Tokyo. He is also the founder of and director of the Silvio Gesell Foundation, a Tennessee-based organization dedicated to promoting the ideas of Silvio Gesell. So earlier on, I had a talk with Josh. This is officially a 5-session course, but depending on how the conversation goes, you might need to extend it. So if that's the case, then we will let everyone know. So, but just for your planning. All right, so Josh, the floor is yours, and thank you.
I should pay
All
attention
right.
to this.
Good evening. I'd like to thank
Well done.
Ibrahima and the Henry George School for having me.
Oh, I got
And
a
thanks to
lot
all
of
of you for joining me tonight to
all
talk
these.
about the
These are.
economic perspective of Silvio Gesell.
Look at me. Look at me go. I have my email open. I'll close that. But I have. This is about housing, cities, Georgism. This is a new Georgism podcast, new to me, the Georgism podcast I didn't know about. This is an article about somebody shared this from the Georgism place, Georgism Discord. I don't know exactly what their point is. And then this is from the Robert Schalkenbeck Foundation about land and entropy and the value nature or the labor theory of value, etc. Oh dear, oh dear. I should subscribe to the Silvio Gesell Foundation. Look at that Goldman Sachs analyst. I also haven't written a blog in over a week. Duh.
Start from Arsenal as you'd expect when you're the visiting team, particularly this Leeds team.
What?
Here, who's sitting a little bit
He doesn't look
back
very
on
young.
song. Andre Arshavin, who has only scored one.
Arshavin.
Get counter-attacked.
Feed him.
Shanak to Arshavin. Once again, over the crossbar from the Russian.
You can't.
So Arteta with the free kick for Arsenal. Oh, nodded down wide. It was Schillaci who rose on the far post.
No, the this time.
Driving run from Ramsey.
Offside. Oh, Ramsey.
Right through the heart of the Leeds midfield. Never on target. Ominous for Leeds this. Shavin working it onto his right foot. This is Ramsey. Lonergan comes. Did that go out of play? No. Yes, it did. Linesman waited and then decided that it had been carried out. But lovely bit of footwork there for Ramsey. Back to the Spaniard Arteta, who has an eye for goal. Lonergan saw that all the way.
Young
Such a good part of
Arteta.
the game, but in terrible trouble with his hamstrings over the years. It's not an injury on.
Who is that?
Arteta's ball in into a very good area. Oxlade-Chamberlain. Vyronen goes across.
Oxlade-Chamberlain.
Leeds fans right by Oxlade-Chamberlain, enjoyed that one. Got to the semi-final, his dad Mark with Portsmouth back in 19...
With 10 men if someone else picks up an injury, so it does limit the situation as well.
Well, not with Arsenal, but I'm sure Thierry Henry will have something to say about that. How long before he's unleashed? This game could certainly do with him. He's got devastating pace when he's in full flight and goes for goal. Well, he made the opportunity and felt entitled to have a... Plenty of red jerseys up here, Arsenal. That's played through towards Arshavin. What a disappointing finish that is.
Arshavin not having a good day.
Really a dull moment when Leeds are around.
Look at that guy.
Those shots tell the story.
A human jet.
Alex Song waiting in the middle. Shamak coming in as well. Corner final in 72. 1-0. Weaving this way and that. We'll get to the byline. It's come all the way through to Shamak. Lays it off. Great save to deny Arteta. Well, that is the best moment we've seen from Arsenal. And Lonergan.
Arteta hardly hit it.
Shamak.
Oh, thank you very much.
Straight to Arshavin. Well, his one goal in the Premier League this season came from a defensive mistake against Swansea, and he almost
Bustled tonight. And the moment seems to come ever.
Ramsey. Lots of space here for Arsenal. Oxlade-Chamberlain. Shamak is there and didn't get ahead of Tom Lees, who heads behind. Song, shooting chance again. Goal kick. Linares gives it back to him. Oxlade-Chamberlain. Lovely flick by Ramsey. Oxlade-Chamberlain, good save again by Lonergan. Still not away, it's Ramsey. All away. Well, that's the sight that the Arsenal fans wanted. Henry no longer, of course, wearing number 14 because Theo Walcott pinched that number once his idol had left the club. And now the pair of them are coming on together. Has he got the pace to beat Thompson? Shamak's layoff, and Oxlade-Chamberlain again tries his luck. Well, real fever pitch around the Emirates.
I don't know how long it had been since Henry played for Arsenal.
Henry 3 times and a miserable night for him. And Thierry Henry, who last faced Leeds in April 2004, he scored 4 times in a 5-0 victory at Highbury.
I guess he went to Barcelona.
Arsenal debut.
Certainly one of the best they've ever seen.
What?
Went through a couple of seasons where he was absolutely prolific, almost
4 years of age now. Arsene Wenger
Oh.
he won't be the same player. He's got offside there.
He played 99 to 2007 with Arsenal, and then he came back in 2012.
This Leeds defense, not like that.
Had 4 appearances and 1 goal.
It was a reverse ball, and it's a foul on Koscielny. Getting ready. Walcott's corner this time.
Hold on. 122-51. It's a 41% strike rate. 254. Was it 174? That's a 70% strike rate. Barcelona. 44% strike rate. He didn't do too good at Juventus.
Can they get it across? Walcott. Ramsey.
But I don't know if he played those positions.
Arshavin, good turn. Is that offside against Walcott again? Oh, it was arrowing in towards Schillaci. Song. Not this time. So he had to get it into touch. Why not? Ramsey. Henry. Arshavin to Song.
Looked offside.
Through for Thierry Henry. What a moment! It had to be Thierry Henry. The script was written, and boy, he read it. Extraordinary. His 12th goal against Leeds. The first chance he got. Welcome home.
Well, whatever doubts he had about making the move, they've just been answered. Great ball from Song. Picks him out, a little bit of movement. Just a hint that he may have moved offside, but once he takes that fantastic first touch, how many times did we see him do this over the years? Just curl the ball into that far corner. Song's first real contribution, smashing pass. And the curtain can now come down.
Oops, What?
So Josh,
Of Silvio Gusal.
let everyone know. So, but just for your planning. All right. So Josh, the floor is yours, and thank you.
All right. Good evening. I'd like to thank Ibrahima and the Henry George School for having me. And thanks to all of you for joining me tonight to talk about the economic perspective of Silvio Gusal. So, by a show of hands, how many people believe that our existing economic system is generating good outcomes? More specifically, how many believe that the economic theories and practices currently in use lead to a good balance of wealth creation and distribution, broad-based opportunity and prosperity, economic stability, and a healthy relationship with the environment?
Nobody.
Okay. Unsurprisingly, not many hands were raised. In a world where people disagree about virtually everything, one thing most people can agree on is that we're not on a healthy, sustainable economic course. Unfortunately, as soon as we start talking about what needs to be done in order to solve our economic problems, that consensus breaks down. Generally speaking, when it comes to the search for solutions, most people divide themselves into two opposing camps. On one side are the capitalists, and on the other side are the socialists. Capitalists tend to believe that private parties interacting through markets with as little involvement by the government as possible is the best recipe for general prosperity. Socialists, on the other hand, believe that markets tend to unfairly enrich the owners of capital at the expense of the working class, and that we therefore need centralized authority to intervene and redistribute society's resources in a more equitable manner. Of course, there are gradations in between, but these two belief systems are the two poles that define the spectrum of mainstream economic debate. And these two groups view each other as opponents, even enemies. It would strike either group as bizarre to suggest that they might work together to arrive at a set of solutions which accomplishes the goals of both groups. These perspectives appear to share no common ground. Most people view capitalism versus socialism as an either-or proposition. Choosing one implies rejection of the other. Of course, given the audience I'm speaking to tonight, this statement doesn't necessarily apply to those in attendance. Anyone who subscribes to the economic perspective of Henry George has already stepped outside of the conventional framework of economic analysis and debate. But as you're all surely aware, such folks make up a very small fraction of the overall population. The vast majority of people still buy into the dualistic capitalism versus socialism framework. But neither of these groups has a historical track record of generating good results. Capitalism generally has strong wealth creation, but most of that wealth goes to a small group at the top, while the majority of people lead a precarious existence in which their basic economic needs are not assured. Whereas countries which have attempted to adopt socialism or communism typically see weak wealth creation and stagnant or declining standards of living. And both systems are perpetually plagued by frequent damaging economic crises. Expecting that either approach will provide the solutions we need is an exercise in repeating the same actions and expecting different results. So if we hope for a better economic future, it makes sense that we must step outside of the conventional capitalism versus socialism framework and search for solutions that do not lie along this artificially narrow spectrum of ideas. Silvio Gesell offers a fundamentally different vision for an economic future which combines the best aspects of both systems, the powerful wealth creation of capitalism, along with the equitable distribution of socialism. Furthermore, Gesell diagnoses the causes of the economic instability, which seems to be an unavoidable feature of modern economies, and shows us how recurring economic crises are not inevitable. And finally, he shows us how our economic practices can be brought into harmony with the laws of nature, so that we can balance the needs of economic development with the preservation of our planet. If I may, I'd like to take a few minutes to describe my own path, because I think it shows how Gesell represents a way out of an economic box that many, many people find themselves in. I was a child of the 1980s. My father is a stock analyst and commodities trader. For me, learning about the markets and economics was a way of bonding with my dad, so I became interested in the subject from an early age. One of my childhood heroes was the iconic character Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. As I started my journey in economics, I subscribed to his famous motto, "Greed is good." I loved the idea of the free market system because it told me that I could strive to become rich and that by doing so, I would also be helping others. The free market ethos says that a system in which everyone is free to pursue his or her own self-interest results in the most efficient use of resources throughout the economic system, which maximizes the size of the economic pie and benefits everyone. It describes economic development as a rising tide that lifts all boats. It's a beautiful idea. It tells us we can have our cake and eat it too. And to the present day, I haven't given up on that idea. So I studied economics in college and then went to work in the financial industry, first as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs in New York, and then as a derivatives trader at Morgan Stanley in London and Tokyo. But I quickly saw that the reality of capitalism didn't look like what I read about in the textbooks. I remember being in a job interview at a major financial institution, and the person interviewing me was explaining in a very matter-of-fact way that his job was to find ways to violate the spirit of the law without breaking the letter of the law. His perspective was that powerful private sector players will always have more brainpower, more resources, and stronger incentives than the government agencies overseeing them. So there will always be a lot of money to be made by staying one step ahead of the regulators. Hearing someone say this so unabashedly was eye-opening for me, and it shook the comfortable complacency with which I embarked on my career on Wall Street. As I saw more of what went on in the real world, I had a hard time reconciling it with what I learned about in my economics classes. I saw the people I worked with getting rich by gaming the system, while every morning and every evening as I walked to and from work, I saw people sleeping on the sidewalks and asking me for spare change. This didn't look like a rising tide that lifts all boats. But the only alternative I was aware of was socialism or communism, which generally seemed to lead to horrible results. From the drab, crumbling apartment buildings in the former Soviet Union to millions of dead peasants resulting from China's Great Leap Forward, I saw no evidence to support the conclusion that socialism or communism represent better alternatives to capitalism. And this was the dilemma I found myself in from my mid-20s to my mid-30s. And this is the box that most people who bother to think about economics at all tend to find themselves in. Do we just have to accept that financial operators getting fabulously wealthy by manipulating the system is a necessary price that must be paid for the benefits of the free market? Or do we have to believe that despite their historical failures, socialism or communism can be improved upon to offer a better alternative to capitalism? I couldn't get on board with either option, and I wasn't aware of any other alternatives. Then in 2007, I was reading The General Theory by Keynes, and I came across an intriguing description of a man I had never heard of before. That man was Silvio Gesell. Keynes described Gesell as an unduly neglected prophet and gave a very positive assessment of his economic analysis. I was puzzled about why I had never heard of Gesell before. Keynes's description was compelling enough that I wanted to learn more, so I decided to go to the source and read Gesell's book, The Natural Economic Order. The fact that it was not in print in English and that I had a hard time even locating a used copy was the first clue I had about just how far off the beaten track this stuff would take me. When I finally read Gesell, what I found was a revelation. Unlike the general theory, there were no complex mathematical formulas or technical jargon. What there was a common sense examination of the processes of wealth creation and distribution, laid out in plain language that anyone can understand. And for the first time, it showed me a way out of the capitalism versus socialism box that I'd been stuck in for so long. Before getting into the specifics of what Gesell says, I want to give a brief biographical sketch of his life. Silvio Gesell was an entrepreneur and self-taught economist born in 1862 in St. Vith, Germany. Due to the humble economic circumstances of his family, he didn't go to university and instead embarked on a career in business as a young man, first in Germany and Spain, and then in Argentina. It was in Argentina that he had the formative experiences which would shape his economic perspective and enable him to develop a groundbreaking understanding of the creation and distribution of wealth. As most of you probably know, Argentina has been in a state of economic crisis for more than 20 years now and just elected a controversial new president. Unfortunately, economic turbulence is nothing new for Argentina, and the last couple decades of the 19th century were similarly tumultuous. Gesell arrived in Argentina in 1887 as a representative of his brother's company, which sold dental supplies. Over the next few years, Argentina would experience extreme economic instability, including bouts of runaway inflation, as well as a severe economic contraction, which had a strong impact on Gesell's business. My colleague, Carlos Luge, the founder and director of the Silvio Gesell Institute in Buenos Aires, describes Argentina as a monetary laboratory. What he means by this is that Argentina has experienced some of the most extreme economic instability in human history. And as is sometimes the case, the fundamental principles of the universe only reveal.
We need a flat tax. Everything resistance. The more you make, the more you pay. It can really be this simple. Government by morons. Flat tax is good, but we should be taxing the value of non-produced. If you prefer type beautiful woman, park, anime, large, breast, gorgeous, in the style of anime, instead of drawing or writing anything, then I think you should quit altogether. You're cooked.
Feel themselves under extreme conditions.
Oh yeah, I wanted.
It's my opinion that if Gesell hadn't experienced the economic upheaval of 1880s and 90s Argentina firsthand while running a business in the midst of it, he very well might not have had the insights which would form the basis of his economic theories and proposals. He began writing on the subject of money in 1891 and became an important voice in the Argentinian political arena, specifically in the debate over the gold standard. Gesell was a fierce critic of the gold standard, and he was a driving force behind an economic reform package in 1899 that initiated a period of economic growth that would last until World War I, and during which Argentina became one of the top 10 economies in the world. Gesell moved back and forth between Argentina and Europe and expanded upon his earlier writings to publish The Natural Economic Order in 1916. The book found favor with Irving Fisher of Yale University, the most famous American economist of the time, and the intellectual godfather of the New Deal. Fisher believed Gesell's ideas could represent a solution to the Great Depression, and described himself as a humble servant of the merchant Gesell. He wrote his own book, essentially copying Gesell's monetary proposals, and worked with the US Congress to introduce a bill based on Gesell's ideas. Unfortunately, FDR viewed the idea as too radical, and the bill was never put to a vote. Gesell's ideas then received prominent treatment in the most influential economics book of the 20th century, The General Theory, which, as I mentioned, was where I first heard of him. Keynes spent 5 pages discussing Gesell's analysis, and although he claims to have arrived at his ideas independently, it's hard not to believe that Gesell's thinking was an important influence on Keynes. A lot of people nowadays with a superficial knowledge of Gesell describe him as a Keynesian. This doesn't make any sense for a couple of reasons. First, Gesell died 6 years before the General Theory was published, and Keynes was 8 years old when Gesell first published his monetary proposals. Second, while Gesell and Keynes have a lot of similarities in terms of how they analyzed the causes of economic crises, they advocated very different approaches to solving the problem. We'll take a closer look at the Keynes-Gesell connection in a later class. It's a fascinating topic, and there's been some very interesting scholarship done on the subject. My friend Carlos Luge, who I just mentioned, wrote a book called Keynes and Gesell, A New Paradigm, in which he makes the case that Keynes essentially piggybacked on Gesell and ended up receiving credit for a lot of ideas that were originally developed by Gesell.
BRB.
Unfortunately, after World War II, Gesell's ideas declined into almost complete obscurity, and he was virtually unknown in mainstream economics for several decades. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in his work, in particular following the financial crisis of 2008, during which the subject of negative interest rates prompted a number of prominent economists to revisit his ideas, notably including Greg Mankiw, a Harvard professor and former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. There have also been a number of papers published by the Federal Reserve and the IMF discussing Gesell's ideas. That being said, Gesell is still relatively unknown in the English-speaking world, and the main centers of Gesell scholarship are in Germany and South America. Before getting into the specifics of Gesell's economic perspective, I want to say a few words about the dynamics of this course. First, I want to be clear that I'm not presenting myself as an expert. I'm not a professor of economics. There are people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do. I'm simply someone with a lifelong interest in economics who has thought about the ideas of Silvio Gesell for over 15 years now. I don't claim to have it all figured out, and I don't claim to have the answers to every question. You might very well have questions that I won't be able to answer, and that's totally fine. My aim is not to build a church of Silvio Gesell. Rather, it's to understand how the world works, specifically how wealth is created and distributed, because I believe we can do a lot better than we're doing. And the stakes involved are extremely high. This is literally life and death stuff. Silvio Gesell's ideas are just the most persuasive, most compelling that I'm currently aware of. If someone comes along tomorrow and presents something even better, I'd like to think that I'd be open to it. As Gesell wrote in the introduction to the Natural Economic Order, of the discoverer's name, truth takes no account. So we should never say such and such is true because Silvio Gesell says so, or because Adam Smith says so, or because Karl Marx says so, or because Henry George says so. In fact, I believe that an important cause of the dysfunction of our existing economic system is the whole idea of authority, of relying on experts. Economics as it exists today is deliberately enshrouded in complex jargon and impenetrable mathematical formulas. This leaves the ordinary person out of the conversation entirely. We're convinced that economics is too complicated for ordinary people to understand, and that we must therefore put our trust in experts and defer to their greater wisdom. I don't believe in that approach, and neither did Gesell. He told us that even if we arrive at theoretically perfect solutions through the approach of deferring to the authority of experts, those solutions won't work. Because economics isn't physics. The economy isn't composed of particles that behave in clear, predictable ways. We are the material of the economic system. We're the cells of the economic organism. We create economic reality. And if consciousness shapes reality, how can we possibly shape a reality that does not reflect our level of consciousness? But that's what the whole idea of deferring to experts is all about. It's based on the idea that there are people smarter and wiser than us who will tell us how to live our lives even if we don't understand the reasons why. I'd like to read an excerpt from Silvio Gesell's Parable of Barataria. I should mention, by the way, that most of the sources I'll reference in this course can be found on the links page at silviogesell.com. The Parable of Barataria is a fictional account of a society that attempts to create an ideal economic and monetary system. In a speech to the assembled community, the leader of Barataria says the following. We must respect our democratic institutions and refuse and refrain from introducing laws which are not fully understood by a majority of our people. However useful such institutions might prove to be, it would be a crime against democracy to obtain your acceptance merely by the confidence with which you honor me. Everything must be paid for in this world. The price of democracy is a travail of life's experience. We must see, observe, reflect, and learn. As Democrats, we must refuse to sanction anything that we do not understand, as long as you do not act on your own judgment, but follow blindly the judgment of others. So long as you have no confidence in yourselves, but repose full confidence in a ruling class, you are not worthy of democracy. You are the fit prey of aristocrats. You can never establish institutions in advance of your mental horizon. Power over men is seldom, if ever, used for their advancement. The state should reflect the state of mind of the majority. You must learn to examine everything for yourselves and reach the best decisions of which you're capable. That may not give you ideal government, but it will give you the government you deserve. Do not aim at institutions beyond your mental capacity. So Gesell is telling us for their advancement. The state should reflect the state of mind of the majority. You must learn to examine everything for yourselves and reach the best decisions of which you're capable. That may not give you ideal government, but it will give you the government you deserve. Do not aim at institutions beyond your mental capacity. So Gesell is telling us to beware of experts, even him. Because even if the experts are wise and well-intentioned, the solutions they come up with will not work unless the members of the community understand them. It's a bottom-up rather than a top-down approach for solving our problems. And it says that any idea that is adopted on the basis of authority will fail, regardless of the theoretical merits of the idea.
This is something that Georges needs to
Only
listen
when
to.
we have all fully thought through the ideas.
Yes, we can't simply pass a land value tax. We need a people to understand that the land is not capital, and the land must be free, and the land is ours. Everybody's. No one's listening to me, though.
For ourselves and adopted them based on our own understanding and judgment, will they have a chance of succeeding? So the purpose of this course is not to convert you to Gesell-ism. Remember, of the discoverer's name, truth takes no account. Silvio Gesell, the man, doesn't really matter. What matters is whether or not the ideas he developed can be used to build a better economic future. So my goal here is simply to offer a perspective that you may not have heard before, and to submit it to your judgment, your critical faculties, your sense of justice, and your understanding of the laws of nature. Having said all that, a lot of what I'm going to say will probably meet with resistance at first. I know this from many years of experience talking to people about the ideas of Silvio Gesell. I know that his perspective is very challenging for most people. It tends to make people uncomfortable. But the question is, why does it make people uncomfortable? Is it because he's wrong? Or is it because Gesell's perspective conflicts with many preconceived notions that we've built our lives upon but may never have explicitly analyzed? My belief is that it's the latter. Our economic lives are built on a foundation of ideas that most of us have never even thought about or questioned. For example, we all know that money earns interest. Most people consider this normal and natural. We learn this as children when our parents open a bank account for us or give us a savings bond as a gift. We learn at an early age that when one saves money, that money grows through interest. We also learn that when one borrows money, one has to pay back not just the amount borrowed, but an additional amount as well. But does interest really make sense? Is it logical? Is it beneficial? Is it consistent with the laws of nature? When a squirrel sets aside nuts for the winter, does he come back later and find more nuts? No, that never happens. In fact, the opposite happens. When a squirrel stores nuts, some of those nuts spoil due to exposure to the elements. Some get eaten by insects, some get lost, some get stolen by other creatures. A store of nuts in
But if your capital is the squirrel itself, the squirrel makes babies. The reproductive forces of nature
invariably loses value with the passage of time. And this is a nearly universal aspect of nature. We live in a universe characterized by increasing entropy. Physical matter
but it's currency that doesn't decay over time, as Ian says. The natural reproductive forces of nature do not decay over time. They do require, they generally require some sort of labor of maintenance, though.
tends to move from a state of greater order to a state of less order. And because of this law of nature, almost all forms of physical wealth lose value with the passage of time. So why does money behave in the exact opposite way? Why does money gain value with the passage of time when everything else loses value? This is an example of a simple, straightforward question that most of us have probably never thought about, but which affects virtually every aspect of our economic lives. So this course is as much about examining the ideas that form the foundation of the economic status quo and asking if they make sense, as it is about promoting a specific set of solutions to our economic problems. A big part of the work that needs to be done in order to build a better economic future involves consciously examining modes of thought that are irrational, harmful, or unnatural. Because since our consciousness shapes reality, if our understanding of economics is flawed, our economic reality will be flawed as well. there are very few new ideas that one needs to learn in order to understand the Gussellian perspective. Most of the work that needs to be done in order to grasp Gussel's viewpoint is to discard preconceived notions that don't hold up to logical scrutiny or that are not consistent with the laws of nature. But this is not an easy or comfortable process. I can tell you in advance that a lot of what I'm going to say is going to bring up questions, doubts, or even discomfort. Imagine for a moment that I could prove to you by way of undeniable logical argument that what we have always believed to be the vertical direction is not in fact vertical. Let's say I could convince you at an intellectual level that this is actually vertical. Would that logical proof enable you to immediately incorporate that truth into your life? Would you immediately start to see that all buildings, all doorways, all street signs are in fact crooked? No, because intellectual knowledge is only a small part of human experience. So simply grasping something at an intellectual level is not enough to enable us to fully incorporate it into our understanding of the world. And the same is true of the Gussellian economic perspective. The intellectual part of it is
Not
actually
sure
quite
about
simple.
that example.
Here it is.
I believe that the Earth goes around the sun, that the Earth is not flat, but this is not in accordance. Is that a hole in my shirt? No. This is not. Does not match my physical day-to-day intuition. Go ahead. Go on, Josh.
Private ownership of land is unnatural, and our existing form of money is irrational. That's it. That's the whole Gussellian perspective. The rest of it is all thinking through the ramifications of these two ideas. But simply convincing people of those two things at an intellectual level is only part of what's needed in order for them to be able to incorporate the Gussellian perspective into their understanding of the world, because we have a lifetime of experiences standing in the way. Every crooked doorframe will still look straight a minute, an hour, or a day after I demonstrate logically that it's not. And that's essentially the case I'm making regarding economics. Due to some fundamentally flawed ideas which form the foundation of our economic lives, every single structure built on that foundation is crooked. Every single economic transaction that takes place in a system with irrational, unnatural systems of money and land is irrational and unnatural. So if I make an intellectually convincing argument that interest is artificial, irrational, and harmful, does that mean people are going to suddenly start lending money without interest? No. Absorbing and integrating new ideas is something that takes time, and it requires more than just intellectual argumentation. We need to experience the truth of these ideas. And since the world as we know it is built on other ideas, the status quo is a big impediment to understanding. All of the structures and patterns we live by reinforce the existing perspective. So making the transition is a long, arduous process that must include more than just thinking about it. It must also include lived experience. In the last session of this course, we'll talk about just that. How might we create lived experiences which incorporate Gussellian principles and enable us to integrate the Gussellian perspective into our lives? Okay, without further ado, what did Gussell say? Gussell asked the same question that Karl Marx and Henry George asked. Why does the incredibly powerful engine of wealth creation of capitalism seem to invariably lead to widespread poverty, ever-increasing wealth inequality, and recurring economic crises? Why does capitalism not create a rising tide that lifts all boats? Marx concluded that private ownership of capital inevitably leads to economic exploitation, and therefore labor will never receive its full proceeds as long as capital is privately owned. Henry George had a very different answer. He said that the free market system would in fact lead to a rising tide that lifts all boats if it wasn't for one thing, private ownership of land. He was a believer in the free market system, but he saw that private land ownership causes much of the wealth created by capitalism to flow into the pockets of landowners instead of raising the living standards of the working class. Silvio Gussell agreed with Henry George's analysis of the land problem. However, he believed that George's diagnosis of the causes of our economic problems was incomplete. Gussell adds another dimension to Henry George's explanation of the causes of economic dysfunction. He shows how our irrational form of money prevents it from circulating in the way that we need it to in order for the free market system to deliver on its promises of robust wealth creation, broad-based prosperity, and economic stability. If we think of money as the blood of the economic organism, Gussell tells us that due to our incorrect understanding and formulation of money, the blood that currently flows through our system is as if it were magnetically charged. Instead of flowing freely and naturally to where it's needed and in the correct quantities, it instead flows toward where there is already too much of it and away from where there's not enough. And this basic insight explains a great deal of the general dysfunction we see in our economic system. It explains why we continue to see poverty no matter how much wealth we create. It explains why our system always trends toward greater wealth inequality. It explains why capitalist economies are always prone to periodic economic crises. And it explains our unsustainable relationship with the environment. So Gesell starts by affirming the correctness of free market theory. He believes that a system based on individual freedom, private property, and free competition is essential for the material progress of mankind. Does that mean he was a capitalist? Absolutely not. Most people consider the terms capitalism and the free market system as synonyms, but they're not. According to Gesell, what we know as capitalism is a pathological variant of the free market system that has resulted from the fact that we have fundamentally misunderstood the correct and natural roles and functions of land and money. He shows that our existing systems of land and money are violations of the core principles of the free market system. Therefore, the solution isn't to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as Marx wanted to do, and replace free markets with centralized control of the economy. Rather, what we need to do is fix the two problems of money and land. If we do that, Gesell says that the free market system will, in fact, do what the textbooks say it should do and create a rising tide that lifts all boats. The common element that ties together the subjects of land and money is that both are instances of improper appropriation of the commons. What are the commons? The commons are natural or cultural resources that by their nature belong to society as a whole and should be managed in the interests of the whole community. Examples of the commons are things like water, air, public airwaves, etc. They're things that no private individual creates and therefore cannot be held as private property without doing grave harm to the community. I'm sure I don't need to explain why it would be unacceptable to allow anyone to privatize air. Gesell tells us that money and land, properly understood, should be considered as parts of the commons. And he furthermore shows that this is completely consistent with the concepts of private property and free markets. The core idea of the free market system is that people should be allowed to pursue whatever activities they choose, that they should compete with each other on a level playing field, and that they should be allowed to keep and dispose of whatever wealth they create in whatever way they see fit, with as little interference from the government as possible. But money and land, properly understood, are not wealth. Did that statement make you feel uncomfortable? Because what I just said is an example of what I discussed earlier. Ideas which conflict with preconceived notions that we have built our economic lives upon, but may never have consciously thought about. Most people would say, of course, money and land are forms of wealth. But what is wealth? It turns out that's not such a simple question. Is gold wealth? Is a tree wealth? Is water wealth? In order to answer those questions, we first need to agree on a definition of the word wealth. Adam Smith defined wealth as the possession of useful and transferable material objects whose acquisition or production implies labor. Personally, I think that's a pretty good definition, although we could have a whole discussion about how best to define wealth. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that tonight. If we use Smith's definition, gold, which has been dug out of the ground and given the form of bars or jewelry, is wealth, because it's useful, transferable, material, human labor has been expended to produce it, and someone possesses it. But what about gold still buried in the ground? Is that wealth? Gold buried in the ground does not fulfill Smith's definition, because no human labor has been expended to produce it. What about water? Well, once again, it depends. Water flowing in a river is not wealth, according to Smith's definition, but bottled water is wealth. What about land and money? Does human labor create land and money? No. But perhaps an even more significant way in which money does not fulfill the definition of wealth is in whether or not it is useful. So now we need to define the word useful. Again, most people would immediately object to the statement that money is not useful, but I would argue that this is a correct and accurate statement. What does the word useful mean? It means something that directly fulfills a human need. Food is obviously useful. Clothing is useful. A house is useful. But what direct use does money have? If I give you a $100 bill, what direct use can you get from it without exchanging it for something else? I suppose you could burn it to warm yourself for 3 or 4 seconds, but other than that, a $100 bill has no direct usefulness. Money is obviously very important, but that doesn't mean it's useful or that it's wealth. From a Gessellian perspective, money is not wealth. It's a means with which to effect the exchange of wealth. But wealth and the means to exchange wealth are not the same thing. But to the conventional way of thinking, what's more universally thought of as wealth than land and and money. Allowing the commons to be privately owned and treated as wealth rather than as vital public resources which should be viewed as naturally belonging to society as a whole is irrational and harmful. Improper appropriation of the vital public resources, land, and money gives rise to the phenomenon of unearned income. This means that wealth flows into the pockets of people who have not contributed to the creation of that wealth. And obviously, if wealth is going to people who have not created it, there's not enough left over to fairly compensate those who have. I like to say that the entire Gessellian perspective can fit on a cocktail napkin. Here it is. If you receive income without creating wealth, someone else is creating wealth without receiving income. That's the whole Gessellian perspective. Really, that's the whole thing. Appropriation of the commons results in certain members of society receiving unearned income. They receive wealth they have not created. And if some people receive wealth they haven't created, obviously the people who did create it can't receive the full amount of wealth they've created. It's really
The reproductive forces of nature is what George talks about for the justification of interest. Like, if I tame a wild horse and I'm young and I start breeding these wild horses, and that's what I'm laboring to manage these horses, taking advantage of the reproductive forces of nature. I'm receiving income. You could argue that it's my labor creating all this wealth, but it's clearly labor aided by capital, which is, first I created the capital by taming a horse. Now I'm applying labor to the capital or in conjunction with the capital to take advantage of the reproductive forces of nature to make more horses. I am still laboring. However, say I have a kid, say I get old, say I'm weak, and I'm like, hey kid, I have all these horses. I will, pay you wages out of your work, which could be just in the form of horses, of course. A horse is a horse, of course. And then I retire, and my kid starts breeding my horses, managing my horses, and I pay him one horse a year or a horse a month, whatever. But the herd of horses is producing 2 a year or whatever. And so I am still netting a horse a year. This is created wealth. You'd have to argue that my kid, by tending to my horses, created this wealth, but it's the reproductive forces of nature is what George would say. I don't know. Anyway.
that simple. The rest is all elaboration of this basic idea. And this is why this course is titled Beyond Capitalism versus Socialism. Seen from this perspective, the solution to our problems will never be found by choosing between capitalism and socialism. Rather, what Gessell tells us is that free markets and the goals of socialism are not opposed at all. They are in fact completely consistent. Of course, here we need to once again examine how we define words. Much like capitalism and the free market system, most people consider socialism and Marxism to be synonyms. But Marxism is just one version of socialism. There are many others. The very first words of the natural economic order address this point. Gessell writes, "The abolition of unearned income, of so-called surplus value, also termed interest and rent, is the immediate economic aim of every socialistic movement. The method generally proposed for the attainment of this aim is communism in the shape of nationalization or socialization of production. I know of only one socialist, Pierre Joseph Proudhon, whose investigations into the nature of capital point..." point to the possibility of another solution of the problem. The demand for nationalization of production is advocated on the plea that the nature of the means of production necessitates it. It is usually asserted offhand, as a truism, that ownership of the means of production must necessarily, in all circumstances, give the capitalist the upper hand when bargaining with the workers about wages. An advantage represented and destined eternally to be represented by surplus value or capital interest. No one except Proudhon was able to conceive that the preponderance, now manifestly on the side of property, can be shifted to the side of the dispossessed, the workers, simply by the construction of a new house beside every existing house, of a new factory beside every factory already established. So if we can agree that Marx doesn't define socialism, but is just one type of socialism, and that what actually defines socialism is the goal of enabling workers to receive the full proceeds of their labor, then what Gesell tells us is that communism will never achieve that goal. Rather, the only way for workers to receive the full proceeds of their labor is through the perfection of the free market system. So this completely upends the whole framework of economic debate, which sees free markets and socialism as opposed and mutually exclusive alternatives. Gesell tells us that they are entirely consistent and compatible. So to return for a moment to my own journey, I first encountered these ideas in 2007 when I was in my mid-30s. Gesell's analysis made complete sense to me, but I asked myself how I had never heard of any of this before. How did I do a degree in economics and work in the financial industry without ever hearing the name Silvio Gesell? I assumed at first that I must be missing something. There must be some fly in the ointment that I wasn't seeing. Because if the truth was really that simple, I would have heard of this guy before. So the first thing I did was make a trip back to my college, Union College in Schenectady, New York, to meet with my favorite economics professor. This was a guy who I had enormous respect for. I took every course he offered. Surely he would be able to help me sort all of this out. So we sat down 15 years or so after I'd last seen him, and I started telling him about reading The Natural Economic Order. I asked him why I had never heard of Silvio Gesell before. And much to my surprise, he told me that he hadn't heard of Silvio Gesell before either. This was the second clue I got about how far off the beaten track this stuff would take me. For the next several years, I kept looking for someone to enlighten me. What was I missing about Silvio Gesell's perspective? Because if his arguments were correct, it just didn't make sense that no one knows about him. So I started writing articles about Gesell and tried to talk about his ideas to anyone who would listen. And every time I came across a mention of him in print or online, I would try to get in touch with the writer in the hopes that they could enlighten me. In just one example, when I saw Greg Mankiw, the Harvard professor and chairman of the White House Council of Economics Advisors, mention Gesell, I wrote him an email. He was kind enough to reply. I'll read you his email in its entirety. Dear Josh, I'm afraid that I cannot help out here. You're right that Gesell has largely faded into obscurity. I do not know of anyone to point you toward. Greg. For years, I kept writing and reaching out to people, expecting that someone would finally show me the problem with Gesell's analysis, point out to me the flaw that I wasn't seeing. But up to today, that still hasn't happened. And with every year that passes, my level of confidence grows that there isn't a flaw, and that the world just hasn't yet grasped the truth of what Gesell showed us. And finally, just to bring my own story up to the present day, after 10 plus years of shouting into the void, about 4 years ago, I finally made contact with an international network of Gesell advocates and researchers. As I'd been doing for years, I wrote an email to a German economist named Werner Oncken, who has written extensively about Gesell. One of his associates immediately responded to my email, and she put me in touch with the Silvio Gesell Institute in Argentina, since I live in South America and speak Spanish. I then started working with both groups, the Germans and the Argentinians, at first with translating and proofreading, and over time it became clear to me and to them that there's a need for an English language hub for all things Gesell related. And since no one else was doing it, I decided, well, I guess I'll do it. And that's how the Silvio Gesell Foundation came into existence. I hope that it will become a center for English language Gesell scholarship and advocacy. I invite all of you to check out our website at silviogesell.com. There you'll find a lengthy list of links, books, articles, videos, as well as our own Substack newsletter, YouTube channel, Twitter, Reddit, etc. So that's everything I wanted to talk about today. To conclude, I'd just like to give you a preview of what's to come in the coming weeks. Starting next time, we'll delve into Silvio Gesell's analysis of money. We'll start with the basic question of what money is and what it does, and we'll proceed step by step to show how our improperly conceived form of money gives rise to many of the big picture problems which have plagued economies for thousands of years. After that, we'll look at Gesell's simple proposal to reformulate money in such a way that it will properly perform its role as the blood of the economic organism, so that it will flow naturally and freely to every part of the system and provide the energy and information that are required for each cell of the economy to properly perform its function. After that, we'll look at Silvio Gesell's analysis of land ownership, because while he analyzed the problem the same way Henry George did, he proposed a different solution. Since this course is being offered by The Henry George School, I'm sure, will have a spirited discussion when it comes time to compare and contrast Henry George's proposed solution with that of Silvio Gesell. After that, we'll look at Gesell's analysis from the vantage point of other important economic perspectives throughout history. We'll go all the way back to the ancient world and see how Gesell's ideas have some very important points in common with Aristotle and the world's major religions. We'll compare Gesell and the classical economists. We'll compare Gesell and Marx. We'll compare Gesell and Henry George. We'll talk about Gesell in relation to modern monetary theory. And as I mentioned before, we'll compare Gesell and Keynes. And then in the final section, in the final session, will be entitled Gesell in the Real World. We'll look at a number of instances in which his ideas have actually been implemented. I'll also describe a few initiatives that we're working on at the Silvio Gesell Foundation to put his ideas into practice, both in local communities and online. And last but not least, no economic discussion these days would be complete without mentioning Bitcoin. As anyone who follows us on Twitter will know, I'm not a big fan of Bitcoin. Essentially, I view it as the polar opposite of what Gesell proposed. But I do think the cryptocurrency space holds some intriguing possibilities for implementing Gesell's ideas in the digital age. In fact, Gesell's ideas are already being used in a number of crypto projects. So at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions or hear any thoughts that any of you might have.
Thank you very much, Josh, for this very brilliant lecture. We are open for questions. You may, Marty Rollins. Yes, Marty, go ahead.
Oh, great. Thanks, Josh. I'm looking forward to the complete course. I do want to point out that there's a lot of thoughts that Henry George had on money that really haven't been explored by people who call themselves Georgists. I just recently gave a talk about the money question, which I think is probably recorded by now, but it seems like the ideas were the same that Gesell came up with about not being wealth, just like what you were describing. So could you explore any of the possibilities that Gesell read any of Henry George? Because it seems like it's more than just an overlay. It's very close ideas.
Gesell definitely did read Henry George. He mentions Henry George. I attended your class last week. It was incredibly well timed for me in preparing this class.
I do remember.
However, I think that we will agree when we get to the end of the presentation on Silvio Gesell's perspective on money that it is quite different from anything that I've heard either from my own reading of Henry George or from what you discussed in your class last week. I would say we should probably table this particular question until we've covered all of that ground, and then we can revisit this question. And like I said, of the discoverer's name, truth takes no account. To me, it's not important who thought of it first. What is important is who got it right, so that we can get it right.
I agree. Thanks.
Anthony.
Josh, thanks for a great introduction. I can't wait for the rest of the course. I have some questions, but you will cover them in the course. So the only comment that I have was when you said almost all forms of natural wealth lose value with the passage of time. One of the explanations of why we need interest was given to me by somebody who said that in the competition for capital, any money invested in crops or livestock or timber do increase in value over time. And therefore, if capital was to go into, say, manufacturing, then the capitalist would say, all right, I've got this bunch of money, I could invest it in crops or livestock or timber or whatever, and that will grow in time. Or I could invest it in
reproductive force of nature. Get 'em.
manufacturing or industry.
Way to go, Mr. Gelb.
But my capital won't grow in time. So therefore I must charge interest so that it evens the playing field between those other natural investments and manufacturing. So that sort of made sense to me as to why we need interest, but I'm happy to be persuaded otherwise. But they're three examples that jump to my mind of natural assets that do increase in value over time.
Yeah, you're describing a Georgist perspective on interest. We will, in the next 3 sessions, focus almost entirely on the subject of interest. It's incredibly complex, in my opinion. And part of that discussion
Bad
will
sign,
be
incredibly complex.
reviewing all of the major competing theories of interest and asking if they hold up to logical scrutiny. The theory that you're referring to, generally speaking, is the fructification theory. There are basically 3 or 4 broad categories of theories of interest, and we will go through each of them and discuss whether or not they make sense. Certainly, the growth principle of nature is an important part of the picture. I can't go any further into it because it would take a whole another hour or 2.
Yeah, I'll be patient.
Alison.
Thanks, Josh. Anyway.
Thank you very much for a great introduction from your personal perspective too, and how you got interested. And thank you for your deep dive and putting together the foundation and creating this resource for us. It's going to be an awesome course, and even hinting just from this awesome question about interest that we'll go into more deeply. And I would recommend to the questioner about interest, and maybe to all of us, to check out Gazelle's Robinson Crusoe piece that's linked on your website. Yeah, that gives an interesting perspective, Silvia's perspective on interest, that allows for a deeper discussion. And wanted to say, I've been teaching about Gazelle as a high school teacher for the past 10 years. It had encouraged me by finding out about him through discovering Warble and the miracle of Warble. And if that's not already linked into your website, I can share a link to the film. And through that, agreeing with you entirely that we can teach how to design for a third way that gets us past divisiveness into things that really work, that align with nature. And spent the last year in Kenya working, as you mentioned, with one project that is using blockchain in order to create vouchers in rural areas in Africa throughout, including refugee camps. And the name of the film is Shillings from Heaven. And I can share a link at some point with the group, unless it's already on the website. And the name of the organization that's using blockchain to implement a Gazellian model is Grassroots Economics, and that's one good example that we can look at today, well documented. So I just wanted to share that and celebrate. So thanks.
Both of those things, Shillings from Heaven and the Robinson Crusoe parable, can be found on the links page at silviogazelle.com. Also, I am going to read the entire Robinson Crusoe parable from beginning to end. It is so central to understanding interest from a Gazellian perspective. It's 12 minutes long. I've clocked it, but we're going to read the whole thing because it is so important. But if anybody wants to take a look at it before we do that, you can link to it from our links page.
Thanks. Joe.
Thanks so much for that presentation. And I too am looking forward to the other sessions. Your reaction to not hearing about Giselle matches mine, and I also wondered why, and I never heard of Henry George except in passing, and the Chicago Plan except in passing. So it is kind of curious. My question is, did Henry George study the greenbacks? I'm sorry if I said that wrong. Did Silvio Giselle study the greenbacks? I know George was a greenbacker. Did Giselle also look into that and adopt that kind of thinking? Thank you.
I'm not specifically aware if he ever addressed the greenbacks, but he certainly agrees with the principle of the greenbacks, which is that government can and should create currency, fiat currency, essentially, to meet the needs of the economy without any connection with backing. And that's a topic that we're going to discuss, whether money should be backed by gold, by silver, by anything else. Giselle tells us absolutely not, that backing is counterproductive from the point of view of understanding money's true function. To sort of just give a 15-second preview of what we're going to talk about for the next 3 sessions, Giselle says that the medium of exchange function of money is the only appropriate function of money, and that marrying our medium of exchange with a store of value is the cardinal sin, and that that's what leads to interest, and that's what leads to all of the dysfunction of our monetary system.
Sorry, what did you say was the cardinal sin?
Marrying those two functions together, medium of exchange, store of value.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Perry.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thank you, Josh. In your spirit of it doesn't matter where we give credit as long as we get it right, I would suggest that in the 50 plus years since 1971, since effectively the world has been on a pure fiat standard, that we have achieved Gazellian money because there isn't any money anymore. There's only credit. And credit is a wasting asset in the same way that labor is a wasting asset. And since
store of value,
1970, it doesn't matter where we give credit as long as we get it right. I would suggest that in the 50 plus years since 1971, since effectively the world has been on a pure fiat standard, that we have achieved Gazellian money because there isn't any money anymore. There's only credit. And credit is a wasting asset in the same way that labor is a wasting asset. And they are on parity in the current fiat world precisely because credit which isn't put to use rots. And, you know, Gazelle was not the first to discover that. I think Richard Cantillon was. The idea that the closer you sit to the king, the more your money is worth. But it doesn't matter where we give credit, as long as we see that what's actually happening in the economy is that the creation of fiat is the creation of credit. And that credit is either put to use in the productive economy, or it's put to use in financialization of either assets or government favored labor, which creates bubbles. And those bubbles create either price inflation or wage inflation. Separate from that, a quibble, but I think this particular quibble goes right to the heart of the matter. I would suggest that we quit using the phrase unearned income. There is no such thing. That can be definitively proven. Henry George realized that. He used the term unearned increment, which he got from John Stuart Mill, who proved the difference. And the difference is crucial. There is no such thing as unearned income because all income derives from the input of either capital or labor into an environment which has to include the land. And if it derives from solely the input of capital, that capital itself derives from an earlier input of labor. So you're dealing with the same thing, only with a longer chain of etiology to define it. On the other hand, the unearned increment is exactly what both John Stuart Mill and Henry George saw as the problem. If there can be unearned capital gain in the ownership of the land, because the land is made more valuable by the productive activity of the community, then that's the point at which a putative store of value siphons off the real wealth of the community. And that's the thing we need to seek to prevent.
Okay, lots to respond there. You said a lot. I'm going to take it from the back from the end and then go toward the beginning. To the question of whether the term unearned income is accurate or useful, seems to me that it ultimately boils down to an issue of semantics. I'm not sure that it is a make or break consideration on what practical conclusions it leads us to. We'll see once we go through the whole argument if a substantive difference remains. I suspect that it won't, but I'm happy to revisit this question in the last session. The first thing you said was that we don't need Gesellian money because we've already got it. I think I'm accurately paraphrasing what you said. I could not disagree more with that statement. I've written an article specifically about that point because it's a very common response when people hear the Gesellian proposal for demurrage. People, 9 times out of 10, the word for word, why do we need demurrage if we already have inflation? They are not the same thing. And you can find that article on our Substack. We will also
demurrage.
We'll be talking specifically about that point, probably in the 4th session of this course.
Great, thanks. Nick.
Hey, Josh, thank you for all this and the presentation and for the invite. I got through the Institute to be on this. I'm not an economist at all. My background is actually in music, but I have an interest in Silvio Gesell. And so just as one comment and then one question, but the comment is I'm really looking forward to later in the course when you are talking about some ways that we can try to get active and implement this in local communities. That's going to be really useful for me. It's hard to talk about this with people, especially in my circle of people who don't have a finance background, and I don't have a finance background. So, but and then the question I have is, your lecture earlier, I mean, are we going to have access to these recordings, or is there going to be a way that we can? I started trying to take some notes, but it was a lot that you were saying, which I appreciate that, but I just sat back and listened instead and tried not to keep up with that. But that's my question. Thank you so much.
Yes, this course is being recorded. It will be available after the course is complete, both through the Henry George School and also through the Silvio Gesell Foundation YouTube channel.
Great. Tyler. You need to unmute.
Hello. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, it's funny that the last person who was speaking talked about not being an economist and having a music background. That is the same as me. I am a blind musician from Michigan. And I'm actually not a Georgist. I'm a Gesellian. So I found this course from the foundation, I think in a blog post in the foundation. So I'm actually not a Georgist. I'm a Gesellian, and I heard about George in passing, but finally a couple of days ago I read about it. But yeah, I'm more of a Gesellian, and the one thing that I'm curious about as a Gesellian is when I see the different implementations of Gesell, usually more about demurrage money than land stuff, obviously, but whenever I see, like, whether it's from the 30s, like Virgil, Austria, or modern examples would be like the Chiemgauer in Germany, and then of course in the digital currency space there are things like Freicoin and Pally. I actually got into demurrage because of Pally. Yeah. I'm in my mid-20s and I started my currency journey in crypto and digital currency. But I always wondered, did Gesell have a preference? Because notice I mentioned Chiemgauer and Pally in the same sentence. Chiemgauer, local. It's accepted in a couple cities. just like Virgil. It's a Virgil. It's a city currency. Ally, worldwide currency. I've spent it on Korean stuff in Korea, like sent Ally from America to Korea. Did Giselle prefer local currency and be like, don't use this for a country or worldwide? Or was he like did he prefer local currency? Did he prefer like Virgil or Chiemgauer, or did he prefer national or international like Pally or Franklin? Because I know I think it was, I don't know if it was I don't know if it was somebody in Virgil, like present day Virgil, um who wanted to bring Giselian ideas back, or but they had this bitter hatred for Pally, and I have a feeling that it had something to do with um it being an international currency. Maybe a lot of Giselians prefer a local currency like Virgil was or Chiemgauer is now. So did Giselle prefer, was he okay with Dimmerage being used nationally or internationally, or was he a local dude when it came to Dimmerage?
Giselle was, as far as I know, he never talked about local complementary currencies. He was talking about national and international currencies. And this is going to be a topic for the last session of the course. You know, if one accepts the Giselian analysis and proposal, the next question is, what do you do with that? Are you going to get the United States government to change their form of money? Are you going to get any national government to do that? I think extraordinarily unlikely in today's world that that's going to happen. So I wrestled with that question for a long time. And the conclusion that I personally came to is that these ideas can that we can try to accomplish so-called proof of concept at a local or digital level. And if the ideas prove out, if they generate the results that that Giselle says they should, that I believe they should, then you should be able to demonstrate that in practice. And Virgil is an important piece of data. Unfortunately, Virgil only lasted 13 months. So it's kind of hard, and the population of Virgil was 4,000 or 5,000 people. So it's kind of hard to say that that represents definitive proof of a theory of money. But the results were very much in keeping with what any Giselian would have hoped for. But yeah, so long story short, Giselle was talking about national and international currencies. As far as I know, he never even considered the possibility of local complementary currencies, which is much more part of today's Giselian community.
One more bit. I'm kind of wondering, why do you think, whether they know the name Giselle or not, like I said, for example, it's not mentioned, the name is not mentioned in Pally, for example, but how come it seems like even when people do, whether they know Giselle or not, when they use Giselian ideas, it's always the Dimmerage money. You rarely hear people talk about land. Like, for example, I may have even seen that as a hashtag Freigeld on Twitter in like 2020. So the point being, it feels like Giselians are more likely to talk about a Dimmerage money than the land proposal. Why do you think that is?
That's a fantastic question. If we weren't talking to the Henry George School right now, this would be a very different conversation, because the Henry George School is all about belief that private ownership of land is, if not, well, the Henry George perspective is that that is the central issue. The Giselian perspective is that there are two central issues, one of which is private land ownership. But if we were talking to the general public and not the Henry George School, it's a very inflammatory subject to get into, just because, just to put it in black and white, Giselle calls for nationalization of land ownership. Anyone who has not been prepared to think about that is going to respond negatively. Myself and every Giselian in the world knows that. And each one of us has to decide how we're going to deal with that fact. A lot of Giselians choose to talk only about money because they know how inflammatory the land side of the subject can be. And they feel like they have a lot to offer the world just with the analysis of money. I don't subscribe to that, because I don't think that the two issues can be separated. I think they have to be dealt with together. And just to try to keep it brief, here's why. If you if you deny money the store of value function, which is essentially what Gesell proposes to do, to make money so that it cannot be used for the purpose of storing wealth, what is the next most obvious vehicle that people are going to use to store wealth? Land. So
I was going to say precious metals, but go on.
Precious metals for sure, but I would say even more so land. So I think implementing the monetary side of Gesell without the land side would potentially be disastrous. At best, it wouldn't work. So I think that they absolutely need to be seen as parts of a unified program.
Thank you. Joyce.
All right. Thank you, Josh, for your presentation. I say thank you because I think, well, I agree that it's very much needed to discuss these kind of ideas, and I appreciate your initiative and your work. Well, and you outlined all the things you want to discuss in the following session. So there's lots of ground to cover that we can't all cover now. But I just want to mention that I'm also very much fascinated by Silvio Gesell's time in Germany, because many people know about the Wurgel experiment, which occurred, I think, even after he died or near about that time. But before that, there were some, well, there were some followers of his or his ideas who implemented some stuff in Germany. And Silvio Gesell himself even got to be Minister of Finance in the Free Republic of Bavaria.
For 6 days.
I was just going to say. Yeah, that was about as long as he was tolerated. And then he got a court case. But anyway, I know some stuff about that, but there's still some mystery about it as well for me. So it intrigues me, and I wanted to say this, and also I'm interested to know if, yeah, if we will discuss this a bit as well or not.
I'm going to make a note to myself to add the Bavarian Economics Ministry chapter. I didn't plan to talk about that.
Yeah, it's not so much for the monetary architecture relevant, but historically, it's yes, very much fascinating as well.
It is, and just to very briefly talk about that chapter, he was economics minister of a socialist government that he completely disagreed with their economic philosophy. But he said to them, I will be your economics minister if you let me implement my monetary system, even though I completely disagree with everything you think about economics. And they said, you can do that. The government, it was the government that fell. It wasn't that they threw Silvio Gesell himself out. The government only lasted a week. And he made what for me is a stunning piece of oratory in his own defense at the trial that followed. For anyone who wants to look it up, to me, it's one of the best speeches I've ever read. And he got himself acquitted by, largely by popular acclaim because he made such a stirring and compelling case in his own defense. It's a fascinating chapter, and I'm going to make a note to myself to think about whether we have time to talk about that.
All right, just one more thing that is relevant from a historical perspective to think about the relationship between the Nazis, the Nazis from the Hitler Party in their early days to Gesell and his ideas. That is very interesting as well, because, well, they had some comments on interest as well. They didn't do very well in implementing their original ideas, I would say. But it's very interesting how that developed and turned out.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to keep in mind when we are looking at historical events, when Gesell lived and when he died. He died in 1930. So all of the, you were saying before, the Wurgel, before that, there was some implementation of his ideas in Germany in 1932. I'm not aware of any that actually took place during his life.
Oh, there were.
Okay. Yeah. I'd love to know about them, because the first that I'm aware of is 1932.
In the 1920s, there were about 200 firms, but it wasn't in Germany, I think, but it wasn't organized by Silvio Gesell himself, but just some guy who was in dire need during a deflation.
Are you talking about the VARA
exactly.
network?
Yes.
Yeah, but that was not, I mean, at best, that was in the very last years of Gesell's life.
1924 or something.
Okay, well, I mean, the first concrete application of the VARA network was the Spannenkirchen mine, which was 1932. But you may very well be right that there was a network of businesses that agreed to accept a demurrage currency under the umbrella of the VARA network.
Yes. And I think it was a bit earlier, like I said, but that's a detail. Thanks for responding.
Sure. Great. Thank you. So we have 3 more questions waiting. We go to Yanis. Yanis, you are muted.
Yes. I have a question about the things you said about greenbacking. And you said government should have, the right to print money. the question is, should the money be printed before the production of goods and services or after?
I don't know how it's a practically realistic question, because we're not starting from a place where there are no goods and services. We're starting from a world in which there's extremely advanced division of labor. There's global capital markets, even in the time of Gesell, much more so today. So I don't know. I would have to understand the purpose of the question to have any sense of how to answer it.
Money. Like let's take, for example, like what happened, let's say, with COVID. You know, by the stroke of a pen, the economy closes, right? So the economy closes means production stalls, right? And with production stalled, we go and we print like I don't know how many trillions. Would Gesell do that, or Gesell would say, okay, restart the economy, and then as people start working and exchanging, then at the end we're going to say, okay, what did you produce? Okay, here is new money. That's money printed and given to you. That's
okay. Now I understand your question much better. The best I can answer is that Gesell's number one and only rule for regulating the money supply is complete price stability. So he is not an inflationist. He is not a Keynesian. So no, he would absolutely not have advocated just cranking up the printing presses come hell or high water for the purpose of preventing meltdown of an overly leveraged financial system by whatever means necessary.
All right, Ed Dodson.
Really interesting, Josh. I've read Gesell. I have his book, but I have to go back and read it again now that you're going to challenge us. I don't really have any substantive to say other than listening to you in your personal experience. It just very much reminded me of my own, since I was in the banking sector and I spent my last 20 years at Fannie Mae. There was a difference, though. I was able to get the senior people with Fannie Mae to see the connection between the property tax system and the decrease in affordable housing. And so my company actually gave me the charge to go around and give lectures on the importance of moving to a two-rate property tax structure in order to ease the pressure on land prices and therefore make affordable housing more available. The sad part is I was known as the Henry George guy at Fannie Mae. And when I retired, there was no one to take my place. There was no one who had the same commitment or perspectives. And so everyone just went back to the standard thinking that they were getting from all of the experts, who were involved in housing policy, Harvard in particular, but Stanford and the other schools. And it's so frustrating when you feel like you've seen the light and you can't find enough people to grasp the same insight that you have to result in some sort of critical mass for change. And I think that's probably the feeling of a lot of us that are joining you in this.
Well, I think I'm surprised you had as much success as you just said that you had in terms of getting people in that industry to open their minds. The conclusion that I came to through my experience with people in that industry is that they will probably be the last human beings on earth to come around to what Gesell was talking about, because their entire identities are built on the foundation of the status quo. So even if they don't necessarily grasp at an intellectual, logical level that what we're talking about here would represent an existential threat to a lot of what they do, I think they, even before that, they grasp at an emotional level that this is dangerous stuff and that they better not understand it. That's my perspective. I would accept any invitation to go back to Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley and talk to them about Silvio Gesell, but I'm not holding my breath.
I may have had one other advantage that not very many people know this, but the chief economist at the time at Fannie Mae was Henry George's great-grandson.
Oh.
Well, like I said, I believe that the path forward for this stuff is to talk to regular people. I don't think it is to talk to professors of economics. I don't think it's to talk to financial executives. I'm happy to talk to those people, but I don't think they're going to be the ones that are going to pick up this ball and run forward with it. I think ordinary people who see that the status quo is not working and that it is driving us off a cliff and are hungry for something different. And there's a lot of those people out there, ordinary people who just see that the wheels are falling off. And the question is, what comes next? And that's why I think that this is a very timely point in history to be offering this stuff. I think had I been, had I lived 30 years ago and had the thoughts that I'm having, I don't know if those ideas would have found, I don't know if I would be talking to a group of people like this, because I'm sure there were people 30 years ago who knew about this stuff and had the light bulb moment and felt passionate about sharing it, but the word didn't get out. I feel like the time is coming where there's going to be maybe an exponentially larger audience for these kinds of ideas.
Well, that's what we're working on, isn't it? It's certainly what the Henry George School is all about.
Amen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture and the great contributions as well. We will meet again next week, 6:30 on Monday, but we do have another event on Tuesday by Dr. Perry, who's going to be coming back again on the FET. He calls it the FET's Oil Mandate, Regulating Wage Slavery. Dr. Perry, if you are here, would you mind giving us a little bit of an intro?
Thank you, Elohima. This is one more in my unusual but provably correct analyses of what the Fed is actually up to. Last time I dealt with their mandate to control the money supply, and this is one more in my unusual but provably correct analyses of what the Fed is actually up to. Last time I dealt with their mandate to control the money supply and by implication interest rates in the economy. This time we're dealing with the other mandate, which is to regulate unemployment. Between now and next Tuesday, we will get a whole new batch of statistics to work with. The PCE core is coming out. The January employment figures will be out, and the Treasury's Fiscal Bureau statement of account for the month of February will be out, and they will provide a great deal of fodder for demonstrating how lies beget lies, garbage in, garbage out.
Thank you very much, Dr. Perry, and I look forward to meeting you all next week. Good night.
Demeridge. Gasell. Gasell.
Everybody all right? All right, it's Rico. Let me hear it for Rico. And let me hear it for Dick. This next one is called Shanghai Check. It's off Rico's album, That Man Is Forward.